a lot of the stigma around sex has to do with our bodies and our relationship to our bodies, just because we think of sex as being something that's not only something intimate to share with a person, but something intimate to experience with yourself.
There's a lot of sort of secrecy concerning bodies and bodily functions and acts.
This is something very ingrained in our society from the time that we're very young. Just the conversations we have around sex. It is something still considered very shameful and dirty and wrong.
I think it is sort of the result of a very core part of American culture and history. In our sort of Western culture, I think specifically it comes from a history of government values and Christian values kind of being fused together.
Because of the stigma, we don't feel like we can educate people, or even just, it can sometimes be a difficult conversation to have with a partner, just about how to make this experience as safe as possible.
The social aspects of sex really need to be included there. Consent. I think it's so important to be able, like, if you're going to have a healthy relationship, to be able to talk about sex. Just like sex education would be like a start, but
I know a big thing is the lack of sex education, in particular the educational system in the US.
I never got sex ed in all of my years.
Definitely limits how we're able to talk about sex in like a formal like school setting, and it also, I think, makes it very difficult for parents to talk about sex education, because if parents, they weren't educated in school and maybe didn't grow up with the internet, and their parents probably didn't talk to them about sex, it's very difficult for them to discuss sex with their children, not even just ways that sex can be pleasurable and beneficial, but even just how to navigate like consent, boundaries, safe conversations.
And then also, I think part of sex education that doesn't have to do with physical safety is just normalizing discussions on not only, what the basics of sex are, but that not only do different sexual attractions exist, right? If we talk about sexuality, if we talk about attraction to other people, right? That's part of it. And if you're able to talk about that even in a school, in an educational process, in an educational way, just educating people on like who you can be attracted to is I think very helpful and very safe in normalizing that.
A lot of the time queer relationships and queer sex are seen as, especially not appropriate to talk about, because we consider queer people to not be family friendly, because they're controversial, or they're seen as unnatural, or just, too small population to care about or talk about, especially in sex ed curriculum. I know a lot of times people told me, we don't need to include LGBT people and, the kind of sex they have, because that's such a small portion of people. Like, why would we put in the effort and the resources to including them when there's so few of them?
There's not a lot of representation of what queer sex is, what it looks like in media. If you're a young queer kid growing up, you're not watching any movies about that.
We kind of just see it as not existing. We don't really talk about sex with trans people, because I think they're kind of either over-sexualized, especially trans women, and how they're depicted in the media, often as like sex workers, or like predators even, or they're like treated as completely without sexuality. Like, we can't even comprehend that they have a sexuality and that sex with them works. It's like I think it's like a whole other ball game, because it's just there's an even further like deviation from like what is deemed acceptable sexuality when you are queer and or trans.
There aren't a lot of spaces to talk about sex very openly, and people have to take that on themselves to learn about. And I think people learn a lot about sex from porn at a very, very young age, and it really portrays a very narrow image of what real sex looks like.
Most people, I guess not everybody, but pretty much everyone watches porn. You don't learn about consent from porn, really. There's like really fucked up porn categories that are pushed, that are really popular. That's not how to learn about like healthy relationships and like consent is such an important part of sex.
And, you know, there's a lot of different opinions on like pornography and like what is good porn, what is ethical porn. But a lot of time the porn that is free and mostly accessible to people, and oftentimes their first interaction with information about sex online is sex that is unrealistic, people with augmented bodies. It's very heterosexual, very white, very able-bodied. Sometimes the sex is very male-centric.
Women especially, or people with vulvas, like tolerate a lot of discomfort and pain when it comes to sex. Like they don't know what it should be like. And they're like, this is something I have to do or get over with.
We talk a lot about this idea of, you know, if a woman chooses to have sex and if a woman chooses to have sex with multiple partners, then, you know, she gets labeled as a slut. And oftentimes if a woman doesn't make that choice, then she gets labeled as a prude. And I think that has so much to do with the fact that we don't feel comfortable talking about sex generally, and we specifically don't feel comfortable talking about female sexuality.
We have a very narrow definition of what is acceptable sexuality in like American society, as a society that is capitalist and, you know, kind of ruled by Christian values. We have an even thinner margin of what is acceptable for women's sexuality.
Throughout history, like a lot of art is of, for example, female bodies, which is often drawn by male artists. And nowadays it's more common for women to be able to draw their own bodies or to like take ownership of their bodies, but it's still often regarded as this very taboo thing, or it's censored very heavily.
Women's, you know, nude bodies are often something that is like meant to be consumed in TV or film.
We look at images of sex all day, right? The media is selling sex and advertising it and showing it all the time. And so it's interesting that we're all constantly looking about sex and in many ways constantly talking about sex, but not really.
Media portrays sex in a very narrow way, even just in like movies and rom-coms and magazines and reality TV. We see all these images of what sex should look like in relationships, and it's a pretty narrow view.
You can show someone getting their like brains blown out, but we don't want to show like someone's genitals or someone having sex.
On social media, stigma around sex, I would say like treatment of sex workers is how I see it the most frequently. Just like people who have like second accounts, third accounts, like a lot of backup accounts, people whose pictures get reported, even like accounts with very large followings are at risk for being reported, at risk for being deleted if they're not careful about following like very arbitrarily applied guidelines. And of course, it's like the guidelines are applied more harshly to bodies that don't fit a thin white beauty standard.
In a way, sex is weaponized against different groups to police their sexual activity.
You internalize the stigma and this discomfort, and you can be in all these different situations where you're not in full control of your own body and you're not able to, or you didn't even get the tools when you were young to explain with a certain vocabulary, this is how I'm feeling, this is what I want, how's it going, that sort of stuff. And it's very limiting.
I think it's great that people are on their own trying to learn more about sex and sex stigmas, but I think on like an institutional level, like across the board, there's a lot to be done.
I think we can really challenge it by, you know, challenging what kind of love is allowed to be shown on TV, how we allow women to be represented on TV and in films. And I think also just from a local grassroots sense, because, you know, sex education curriculums aren't just made by the state, they're also oftentimes made by local school boards. And so it can involve, you know, community involvement and organizing to make schools a place that is sex positive and, you know, promotes comprehensive sex education information. And then, you know, that teaches those kids that sex isn't something to be ashamed of or scared of. and that sex can look like a lot of different things. And then those kids can grow up to be our leaders and our politicians and our community leaders. And I think that's kind of how you create like a cultural shift. But that's an effort that's going to take a long, long time.
It starts with just talking to your friends, and then it starts with, you know, being able to talk more openly, if that's something you're comfortable with other people, and people you don't know, because there are other people out there who are experiencing the same things and don't know it. And you always feel that your sex life is so individual, and it's not that it isn't, but many other people can relate and don't know that other people are going through the same thing. And it's good to have people to be able to go to, because institutions are so often, you know, failing us.